Story about the Holocaust for Jews is the Holocaust was an atrocity. They suffered and they were killed not because of their reason and not because of their choice, but because choice made by others. And they faced a situation in which they had no ethically proper choice. They had the choice between the impossible and the horrific. Jehovah's Witnesses were classically, in that sense, martyrs and tragic figures. They understood precisely why they suffered, and they had the capacity to imagine enduring it and outlasting it. The interesting thing is that people who study suffering say that the person who understands why he suffers and for what he suffers can endure a greater amount of suffering without it destroying their self and their soul. So Jehovah's Witnesses had a higher rate of survival than other victim groups in the camp. They had a higher level of solidarity, and they had a higher level of being able to maintain their own peculiar spiritual integrity. Actually, their own unique spiritual integrity. Peculiar is to give it a pejorative description. Their own unique, they had a higher, they had an easier time retaining their own unique spiritual integrity, something that was denied to other victim groups because they lacked the mechanisms of solidarity, most particularly, for example, the German male homosexuals, who died in far greater percentages among the incarceration, whose number of incarceration was somewhat comparable to the Jehovah's Witnesses. Very often in the camps, there was the war of all against all. People survived in part because human beings offered assistance to one another. That kept people from going down to the deepest level of savagery. And women's experience differs from men in that women report that they had the equivalent of camp sisters, that they established a close relationship with somebody else that enabled them to overcome at least some of the brutality of it all. Jehovah's Witnesses had group solidarity, and they had a greater sense of allegiance one to another and a greater sense of assistance one to another. They also offered assistance to other prisoners, at least in the recollection of survivors in their memoirs. They offered assistance to one another with a greater frequency, and they succumbed less to the brutality of the camps than other groups. If you read survivors' memoirs, you're impressed with the way in which Jehovah's Witnesses retain their integrity. One survivor said of Auschwitz, if you cried, you died. If you expressed feelings, feelings were dangerous. Most people who went through the camp experience became numb. And it was only later that they could return to absolutely feeling, and they could return to the full sense of normalcy in terms of values or anything else. Anybody who was unprepared to organize, which is a combination of to trade, to steal, to arrange, to negotiate. Anybody who was prepared to organize had a very difficult chance of survival. So that you had to break the system in order to survive, especially if you were Jewish, because the system wanted to kill you. It wanted to destroy you. It wanted you not to exist. Remember, the other reason Jehovah's Witnesses could retain their integrity is they weren't under a death sentence. They merely had to endure the suffering. Jews were under a death sentence.